to watch us. I don't really expect that anybody else is going to come into the hangout with us, but they may. People, but some people, may view us. And then what I generally do with things are make them into smaller clips. I'll probably do that with this one. And let's go ahead and get started. My name is Michelle Odom. I am host of a couple of different book groups, and I decided to use the one I call the Revolutionary Love Leadership series to discuss the book that we're going to talk about tonight. I am located in New York City, and if our other love leaders would introduce yourself, Africa.
All right, I am, my screen name is Africa Sankofa, and my real name is Karen Johnson, and I am located in Salt Lake City, Utah. I teach at the University of Utah.
And Karen is really the inspiration event. She read about the book and posted about it, and we kind of took it from there. Amira.
Yes, I'm. My name is Amira Davis. I am an independent scholar. I live in outside of Atlanta right now, in Smyrna, Georgia.
Oh, well, nice to meet you, and thank you for joining us. And this is my first time sort of Karen Africa Sankofa Johnson. So I'm excited about that. We actually got to know each other a little bit. I did a Facebook study group that was started by a friend of mine, Peter Matthews, who's actually from Cincinnati, where this book is focused on. But Peter did a book group on Manning Marable's book called Malcolm X, Life of Reinvention. And that had about 600 people in it across the globe. But there were really only a handful who were active, vocal participants in that. And Karen Africa was one of those active people. So I kind of had a sense of your spirit ever since. That probably goes back to about 2012 or so.
Yeah, I think it was 2011 when Manning died. Yeah, it was 2011.
2011.
That was a wonderful book group.
Yeah,
that
was amazing. Amazing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think there's I think there's interest out there, and we just have to figure out how to keep it going.
Okay.
I guess just in terms of now, it's good if everybody can keep their mic open just so that you can respond quickly with anything you want to say or any reactions you're having to whatever anybody else is saying. But certainly, if there is noise going on in your background, it's a good idea to mute the mic.
Okay.
Tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about this book by Nikki M. Taylor. It's called Driven Toward Madness, The Fugitive Slave, Margaret Garner, and Tragedy on the Ohio. And, I'll confess, Karen, I haven't What do you like? You like to be called African Sankofa now?
So on Facebook, I'm using Africa Sankofa.
Okay.
Yeah. 'Cause I like
Give us a little background on how you came about using that name.
Oh, that I've been using that as my handle or screen name over the past 20 years.
Okay.
And ever since 45 got in office, I just switched out my real name and put in Africa Sankofa because I'm going to be
Okay.
a little bit more controversial and keeping it real in terms of expressing my feelings about 45.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I understand.
Okay.
So my first name is Loga, and people on Facebook generally know me as Loga. That was my mother's name. She was Loga Isis. I'm Loga Michelle, and most of my real friends know me as Michelle.
Okay.
But I also have an African name that I never use. But and that's Iyafemi Akayete, which
Uh-huh.
means Iyafemi means mother loves me, and Akayete means grandmother is reincarnated. And I got that name in one of those naming ceremonies,
Mm-hmm.
Afrocentric people do, and and it was interesting at the time because I got it when I was about 20 or so years old, and I was struggling with my mother, and so that it came up, mother loves me, and the other part, Akayete, people had always told me that I looked just like one of my grandmothers. So I thought it was
Okay.
interesting how that came about. And I think there's just something powerful in naming yourself, which is
Oh,
what Margaret and Robert Garner did as a part of their story when they finally made their way to freedom.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I do want to confess, so I'm not as prepared as I like to be for these kinds of things, but such is life. I did do an agenda though. Did you guys?
Yes, I had your agenda.
I just sent a few minutes ago. There's nothing rigid about it. I had said to Africa Sankofa up with a couple of questions and see where it goes. So that's still what I do.
Okay.
And Mira, certainly if there are any questions or things that you'd like us to focus on, please feel free to interject that. We also didn't set a hard for this. I think I may have put 9 o'clock on the invitation
Okay.
book, but we don't have to be committed to that. We can stay less time or more time, however we're feeling.
Okay.
So normally I do write a little summary of the book or chapter, but I didn't have a chance to do that. But Keisha Blain did. This is actually from the article that Africa Sankofa posted a few months ago that got us thinking about doing the event we're doing tonight. So I'll go ahead and read by Keisha Blain. Was the runaway slave who, when confronted with capture just outside of Cincinnati, slit the throat of her toddler daughter rather than have her face a life in slavery. Inspired Toni Morrison's Beloved, a film based on the novel starring Oprah Winfrey, and an opera. Yet her life has defied solid historical treatment. And Miss Nikki M. Taylor brilliantly captures her circumstances and her transformation from a murdering mother to an icon of tragedy and resistance. First African American woman to write a history of Garner grounds her approach in Black feminist theory, with trauma studies to account for shortcomings in the written record. In so doing, she rejects distortions and fictionalized images, probes slavery's legacies of sexual and physical violence and psychic trauma in new ways. About a figure who had been rendered an apparition. As by Keisha N. Blain, a contributor, historian, writer at the HuffPost, and a professor who wrote an article back in February called 7 Notable New Books on Slavery. And so this is one of the books she covered. Would you like to add anything by way of summary about the book?
I really and thoroughly enjoyed this book. I felt that with the limited history on Margaret Garner, I really felt that the Nikki Taylor did an excellent job in terms of creating a composite of her personality. And I liked how she drew on a variety of sources, be it in fields, be it psychology, history, gender studies, etc., to help us understand this particular character, especially in light of her own writings or her own public records are so limited. So I felt that the author did an excellent job in reconstructing this particular character. Mm-hmm. But one of the questions I wanted to ask is, so in light of that, I do feel that she did an excellent job in terms of recreating this and reinterpreting Margaret Garner's life. But at the same time, one of the questions is, a lot had to do with conjecture and reinterpreting history to create this character. And so do you feel that, how do you feel about the reconstruction of this particular character? Do you feel that a lot is, in portions of reconstructing this character, do you feel that she's over creating this character, or do you feel that she's right on target in terms of helping us be clued into Margaret Garner? Is that making sense?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Amira, do you want to respond to that?
Well, I haven't read the book, and I think Karen or Africa Sankofa invited me because there was a conversation online. Maybe she had posted the book, and I was saying that I was very interested in learning more about Margaret because I'm in the process of writing a manuscript, and in 2 chapters, I talk about her. I talk about her in 1 chapter in terms of reproductive justice and her heroic act, and I call it her heroic act to her act of infanticide, and also the fact that she was willing to sacrifice her life and the lives of her other children in order to avoid being taken back into slavery. And I look at the dynamics around her life, which included, just the whole amoral structure of slavery, how she was possibly having children by her slave master while she was actually married, and how she was denied even that dignity of being married and of motherhood. And then in another chapter, when I discuss elder motherhood, I look at Toni Morrison's Beloved, and her character, Baby Suggs, has always been one of my favorites. But I think what I did was I questioned Karen, I'm sorry, Africa Sankofa, as to whether in this book there's that they give any context to her family life afterwards, because of course, you know, Toni Morrison imagines Setha going back and living in Baby Suggs' home, and that's the home that she supposedly escaped to. So I was just wondering about the correlations, and I really wanted to get the book and read it just so I could deal with these two chapters, but I hadn't done so yet. So Africa Sankofa reached out to me just a little while ago to ask me if I wanted to listen in on this conversation, and I thought it would be good because I did go back, and there are I don't know whether it was Google Books, but I was able to get some excerpts from the book, and you know, not every page. I was able to read through some things that I used to support some of my ideas about Margaret Garner's reproductive injustice, looking towards a reproductive justice movement.
So that's interesting, Amira, that you see Margaret Garner as engaging in a heroic act, because Nikki Taylor, what she does, she recenters the conversation and she reinterprets Margaret Garner almost in that particular way as well, because during that time frame, the author, Nikki Taylor, draws on a lot of the public documents and the court records, as well as newspapers, that critique Margaret Garner as someone who is a bad mother, who is immoral in terms of murdering her kids. But with this treatment of this book by Nikki Taylor, she reinterprets and rearticulates a different kind of understanding for us to understand what this woman does in terms of how she feels as a way of liberating her kid. And in fact, Nikki Taylor, I forgot which page is it on, has a statement where when Margaret Garner is questioned, and a question whether or not what she did was wrong, you know, they're trying to draw on her to say that what she did was wrong, the interviewers. And she said, at least my child is free. You know, I'm paraphrasing. She said, at least she's free. At least she does not have to go through the horrors of slavery, you know, the horrors of being female and raped and enslaved in terms of economic slavery, you know, et cetera. And so I do appreciate how that recentering and rearticulating this woman in light of her condition, in light of the immoral aspect of slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I appreciate it too. And in terms of your question, Africa, it was different. I mean, Nikki Taylor, I think, is currently the chair of the Department of History at Howard University. So she's a historian. And it was unlike any history book that I've ever read. And it's because she uses all these different angles to try to help us understand Margaret Garner may have been experiencing and thinking and feeling before, during, and after the incident. And as a Black person that has read a fair amount of Black history, she starts out really painting a picture of conditions, of not only conditions, but the atmosphere of slavery. So I personally didn't feel like it was necessary to the story. But then I was listening to you by this woman, I think is a white woman, Roberta Schultz, who favorably reviewed the book. But one of the things that she was talking about was that idea of how harsh slavery was. And so Taylor's description, had really given her a feel for it. So I think there are always these people out there, even other Black people, who don't seem to be able to imagine somebody else's pain. So I appreciate the work that Taylor did, because I think it helps us that a regular history book probably would not.
Right.
And I don't know if the conversation was necessarily about the book, and I've seen her story come through social media several times, and one of the most recent times that I saw it come through, there was that discussion about I think it was a African American male that he just couldn't understand how anybody could do that, and just how wrong it was. And so there is that perception that no matter what, you don't kill your children, you don't kill, period. They're coming from their own spiritual understanding. And I argued in this piece that I was writing that she was coming from her spiritual understanding. She had a belief in a higher power. And a lot of, I've read some of the enslaved narratives, that their belief was that when they died, they returned back to Africa. So
Right.
the belief that there was something better, and that's just a part of the theology that has existed since slavery, is that is greater later, and there's something beyond here. And so for me, as a mother, I totally understood. She's not the first person to commit infanticide. Infanticide was a part of the resistance of slavery, as was the use of birth control or denying sex when ever possible. So what she did was just dramatized, I think, under the Fugitive Slave Act. That's the reason why it became so well known of an act, but hers wasn't an isolated incident.
Right. One of the pieces that that Nikki Taylor mentions in the book is that that infanticide was not. Indeed it happened, but it was not that common. And I guess I would have to do further research, but I appreciate some of her research where she tries to say that wasn't that common, that you did indeed have women do that, but it was not as common as one would think. And I guess one would have to understand the horrors of slavery. And I think that's the key. In this country, we talk about slavery in terms of mythical assumptions about enslaved people. We don't really unpack the brutality of slavery. And so what this piece does is really help us understand the brutality, particularly the brutality of that particular slaveholder, in which Garner was forced to be subjected to his own brutality. And so that kind of being in a condition of ongoing abuse, of course, would not encourage, but have an impact on how enslaved treat their own family members. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And also the issue of the girls. So Garner had 4 children, 2 boys who were older and darker skinned, like her husband, and 2 girls, one a toddler, one an infant, who were lighter skinned. Maybe may have even had blue eyes. And so, and so the I thought it was interesting that children, while she was married to this darker skinned man, Margaret Garner herself was apparently fairly light. Yet her marriage appeared to be strong, strong enough, loving enough, caring enough to stay together despite tremendous obstacles, and ultimately to escape. And it was 3 generations that escaped together: the grandparents and her husband Robert. And then the 4 children. And Margaret was pregnant at the time of the escape. But so they had stayed together through all of this. And so I thought it was interesting to kind of juxtapose the way a man in that era could still be loving and committed to, though she fairly clearly had been raped by this white man, as opposed to today, where it's kind of hard to imagine that even happening. There's what does it feel like to raise who are the products of rape, and we still struggle with that issue today. There are still some of these rather backward states that want to force a woman to carry a child who's the product of rape, and and she may not want to do that. And so
to that point, and just to go back to the issue of infanticide, and I wasn't suggesting that it was a common occurrence. I'm just saying that it happened because what a desire of Black women.
You're kind of freezing a little bit, Amira. If you get knocked out, Amira, follow the link back into the Hangout. If you can hear me. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay.
Hello. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. I hear you now. Yeah. Sometimes the internet freezes.
The internet here where I am is the connection is bad. But in any case, what I was saying is that our issue has never been wanting to kill our children. Our issue has been wanting to be able to have our children, raise them to adulthood without the fear of losing them, without the fear of them being captured and taken into slavery or sold away or being shot down by police officers. It's not, our issue is not the same as white women, but and it's true that she had these children, and that's a statement that I make, is that despite the fact that she did have a husband, and that these children, I didn't know exactly how many. I thought, did you say it was 3 of them that were
4?
fair? I know she had 4, but it was 3 of them that were fair skinned.
2.
That could have been two.
Right,
Okay.
the last two.
But
Yeah, the last two kids.
these children, obviously the children of her rapist, but she loved her children, that they were her children. And, you know, there are all kinds of personalities. So her husband, obviously, that understood, you know, what was going on. Um, love he had for her was stronger. Again, I think it is important to note that she was only, what, 26 when she died? So how old was she?
About that, like 24, 25.
Yeah, so her life was relatively short. Her reproductive period, her marriage, her all of that, you know, all of that happened in a very collapsed period of time. So
Right.
I think that that's important to also note.
Right. The other thing that, and I appreciate your point because it's also making me see the importance of the family unit during slavery. And we see that in the beginning of the book, Nikki Taylor talks about how in the middle of the night, like the husband, okay, I'm gonna back up. The husband had been spending some time going back and forth to Ohio in the Free State. And he had the freedom to do that because the slaveholder trusted him. And so when they had made their escape, Margaret, her kids, her husband, etc., they made this escape in the middle of the night on the icy Ohio River. And so to do something like that, they were really risking their life, and especially taking little children with them. To take small children in terms of escaping was indeed risking your chances of getting caught again. So you do see that strong commitment to the family unit. And so their story really speaks to that, the importance of family and the importance of being liberated at any means necessary, even if it means taking all of us across that Ohio River, icy river, to be liberated. So that, yeah.
Yeah. So, where should we go next? One of my questions says, is madness the only reason a mother would kill a child? Is madness an effective response to enslavement, oppression?
Right. I think that's an excellent question. And
is it more loving to kill a child or condemn it to a life of slavery, poverty, oppression, and abuse? And I just want to say there's a current story in the news a couple of days ago. I don't know if you caught it. A Hispanic woman who had 5 children and a husband. She killed everybody. I guess she would call Margaret Garner inefficient. Killed everybody. I don't know her story, but we know she's got a story.
Right. I think again we have to look at it in the context in which. No,
I didn't. I'm sorry.
Hello.
Yes.
Sorry.
The transmission again is breaking up, and then as I said, I have a couple of grandchildren here. I have to accommodate.
Okay, no problem. Did you hear Michelle's question? She raised a real good question.
About whether it was madness?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, as I said, I guess I think it really, how you see it depends on experiences and location. And just my perspective as a mother and understanding the stresses that she probably endured. I'm very empathetic to what her life must have been like. And again, she was very young. I have daughters that are older than she was, and just to imagine what that might have been like, and what the fear. She had been raped. She had been beaten. She had just been abused, and it wasn't just trying to kill the one child. She was trying to kill them all. I mean, she just didn't get that far. I just don't see that was madness. I think that the trauma of what she had had to endure, the hope and promise of that icy river, and thinking that she would find freedom on the other side, and then to find out, it was all for naught, and they were going to be returned back to that. I just think that she made a rational for her decision, again, based on her spirituality and her understanding of life and death.
Right. And I agree with that. And I think also because I read slave narratives as well, and when I think about other enslaved women, we also, what we need to understand, and we really don't understand the extent of the brutality and the trauma that she experienced. We know that slavery is horrific. Harriet Jacobs talks about that in her own narrative, Incidents of a Slave Girl, about the brutality and what it means to be an enslaved female, ongoing sexual harassment, psychological harassment, etc. And whereas she chooses to have children as a way to resist her own slavery, or as a way to resist her own oppression, right? And in her story, we see how she hides for 7 years in the attic, but she wants to be close to her kids. She doesn't do, and so we really have to understand the real context. And I think that Nikki Taylor does attempt to have us by reconstructing the life with that particular slaveholder, the extent of the trauma, but what was it really? It had to be severe. Why would Margaret Garner kill her kids as opposed to, for example, other enslaved women when we see them or read about their narratives where they don't engage in that, but they do other extreme things. For example, like I said with Harriet Jacobs, hides for 7 years in an attic, in her grandmother's attic, just to be close to her children and not run away. Am I making sense?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The limited choices that they had, and we hear about these really extreme, again, heroic deeds. Harriet Jacobs, an example, and just the physical. When I think about what Harriet Jacobs went through, just the physical space,
Right.
and
Right.
keeping at them through a really narrow slit, and
Right.
but she was so determined to mother her children's
Right.
life, because at the other end of that, she talks about hiring out day, and the
Right.
psychological trauma of women having their children sold away from them. She describes the one woman who went out with, I think, six children, and she expected 1 or 2 to be sold away, but they took them all, and she was just psychologically traumatized. And I think I appreciate was Steve McQueen's 12 Years a Slave,
Mm-hmm.
bringing that out in the depictions of Eliza and Patsy.
Right.
That was the first time that people really got a visceral understanding of what it was like enslaved women. I mean, they could never really know, but at least they, and I traumatized by watching that. People got up and walked out of the movie because they couldn't stand it. And I always, I do a lot of work with children, and I talk about the history of slavery as family history. Like, somebody in your family endured this. So
Right.
if you could empathize and really understand, then put yourself in their position, that must have been like.
Mhm.
Right. Right. Very good point. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess um, for me, it is madness, but understandable madness, um, justifiable madness, and Margaret's husband. I mean, this is a story of Margaret Garner, but it really could be any slave story, in the sense that whether it was mild slavery or harsh slavery, um, it was not the fun that some people seem to want to characterize it as. Back then, in that era, if you ran away from slavery, they diagnosed you with madness. They had a name for it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Mhm.
So, one man's madness is another man's freedom quest.
Right. Right.
Depends on where you stand. So not only did her husband and her entire family understand what the experience of slavery was like, to the point that they were all courageous enough and willing to take this very risky, dangerous, potentially suicidal trip. So not only did the family understand, but the Black people of that era, and to a certain extent, Margaret Garner was heralded as a hero by people like Frederick Douglass and other leaders of the day. And so it seems that the closer to being able to empathize with an experience, the more rational it seems that you would respond in ways that others might see as crazy.
Mm-hmm. Right. That's an excellent point. That's an excellent point, because enslaved people were expected to accept their conditions, and so there is a need to rearticulate and redefine madness in that context. And I think that's an excellent point that you bring up.
Thank you.
So it's understandable in that context from the experience of the enslaved. When we center their experiences, we understand their decisions in terms of them attempting to liberate themselves or their kids or their family by any means necessary. And I think that speaks to the essence of that word, that or that phrase that Malcolm X coined, by any means necessary.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And most people then and now are not willing to make such a huge sacrifice. Not even the murder, but just the attempt at escape.
Right. Right.
Risk of death.
Right.
I think that we tend to be driven more by a desire to survive than a desire to free ourselves from whatever may be oppressing us.
Right.
So this comes across as a dramatic act.
Right.
But we're not really free. And
Right.
so it always leads me to wonder, what's it going to take? And
Mm-hmm.
I want to make a point about making that dramatic leap. You look at Sally Hemings to
All
say
right.
and accommodate herself to that situation.
Right.
Um,
Okay.
uh, Margaret Garner, surely, I mean, that was the option. She could stay and just acquiesce to
Right.
that lifestyle, but making that choice to, and as I say, that's really the ultimate all is get free or die trying.
Mhm.
Okay. Right.
So she took the chance, and that's why I guess I'd see the heroic act as, once there was no turning back for her. It was like,
Right.
it's freedom or bust. And
Right.
to get that far and to think about going back to that lifestyle, I think that shows how harsh her life was on that plantation. I don't think that there's any way to think of a good or humane way of being enslaved. You're just either you submit to it or you don't. But
Right.
then I think I heard you talking about bringing that forward to our contemporary understandings of, our situation.
Mhm.
And I always think of maroonage as, where we have to go. We have to find little pockets of ways to isolate and insulate ourselves and um, to find some type of autonomy. And that our goal is to think about these autonomous living situations. How can we escape, but even be inside this madness? Because um, uh, this is an insane situation. It evolved from an insane situation, and it has gotten. It's
Right.
actually just the technologies and the methodologies have changed, but we're still living with terrorism. We
Right.
still and we're actually rapidly going back into that space. So
Right.
I think the reason I used Margaret Garner's story was as to think about all of those things. What is reproductive freedom, and how do we continue to love in spite of it? Because she did. She loved her husband. She loved her children. She loved her family, despite the traumas that were being visited on her young body. And I just can't stress enough her age. I mean,
Right.
she's a very young woman.
Mhm.
The other thing that when we look at her experience as opposed to other enslaved women, for example, Harriet Jacobs or Sally Hemings, what we see is because she was enslaved on a farm, and mostly those who were enslaved on farms were much more isolated from other enslaved communities. And I feel that isolation also plays a part, not having that sense of community from other enslaved people to give you the strength uh, to endure or to find ways to resist. I believe that for example, Harriet Jacobs, she had her grandmother and she had some other women in the community that gave her a sense of hope of hanging on, even though she did eventually escape, but giving you a level of I can do this. I could not do this, but deal with or find ways to resist in a way that does not necessarily engage in acts of violence towards your kids. Am I making sense?
Mhm.
I think
Yeah,
isolation plays a lot of part.
I
Large
understand.
part.
Is that something that came out in the book that they were isolated from other communities, that they didn't have any type of connections to? Because I know that they left with, what was it? There were several families that left.
Yeah,
So
I think
Well,
eight of them.
yeah. And they lived, they more were,
Families. I'm sorry, 8 people or 8 families?
8 people.
yeah, it was 8 people. So the isolation
Okay.
I'm referring to is just being on a farm, for example, as opposed to being on a large plantation
Hmm.
where you are in contact with other enslaved people. And
Right.
so the isolation, for example, Sojourner Truth talks about in her poem "Ain't I a Woman," or even when you read Nell Painter's piece on Sojourner Truth, we understand that she was enslaved on a farm in upstate New York, extremely isolated from other enslaved people. And so that isolation also plays a role in either giving you an isolation in terms of not having a community of other people who are suffering like you to give you the strength to hang in there or deal with or figure out ways to resist. You're just there being oppressed and
Hmm.
without the support of a community of other enslaved people. Am I making sense with that?
Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
I think, a lot of us are dealing with loneliness, isolation today, even though around, I think that the culture of capitalism, individuality, the kinds of values that are promoted in this culture,
Mm-hmm.
even such wedges uh, in our community that we don't necessarily feel that, this is what I was alluding to earlier when I talked about Robert um, being able to understand what his wife had been through and still being committed to her. So often today it seems like even other Black people don't necessarily um, understand our particular plight. Um, if we're not in the same class or live in the same kind of community or whatever, all of which I think is a product of what has happened to the Black community, which we asked for. Um, Even today, there was a guy who sounded like he wanted to fight with me on Twitter. I've been posting a bunch of stuff about Margaret Garner about tonight. And so at one point he said, peripheral issue in academic circles, and don't you think we need a restructuring? Yeah, but I also think we need to do our own thing. And so he kind of got offended by that. So I had to let him go. But even forums like this are an example of doing our own thing. To me, if we're waiting on people who don't understand our pain to fashion forums and communities and solutions, it's going to be a really long wait. Um, so yeah, there was the isolation um, of the antebellum era, but um, experiencing a different kind of it now.
Right. Um, I want to switch over to Lucy Stone, who was an activist, was one of the women who interviewed Margaret Garner, as well as I'm trying to find one of the page, as and so from there she articulated she wanted to focus on the gender aspect of enslaved women and the type of abuse that they were subjected to. And I really felt on page 76, I want to read this passage. And it says, Margaret Garner's final visitor, when she was in jail, there were a number of people who visited her. There was priests, reporters, etc. So Lucy Stone, who was an abolitionist and a women's rights activist who lived in Cincinnati, was one of the people who interviewed her. And so at the bottom of page 76, it reads, Margaret Garner's final visitor was Lucy Stone, an abolitionist and women's rights advocate who lived in Cincinnati at the time. Stone has spent the better part of the decade lecturing and lobbying for equal citizenship for women and is credited being the first person to go to the legislature to advocate for these rights. She believed that motherhood, marriage, and especially slavery denied women rights over their own bodies. Lucy Stone believed in women's bodily autonomy and had spent the better part of her career fighting to liberate women from various forms of bondage. Just before the Garner trial, she had lobbied on behalf of women's rights within the confines of marriage. And so I want to skip to the part where, so Stone becomes one of the first people to allude to the fact that she believed that the child that was killed by Garner perhaps was the slaveholder's child. And so she, let me see where I went. When she came to visit Garner in jail, Stone came as an abolitionist, someone sympathetic to women's rights, specifically bodily autonomy. After Stone's visit with Margaret, a prison deputy assigned to guard the family reported that Stone had tried to pass Margaret a knife. On hearing these serious allegations, court officials summoned Stone to court to explain her actions. At the adjournment of the hearing on Stone responds to the deputy's allegations. She, first of all, she denies giving a knife. But one of the things that she said, and this stands out, she said, when I came here and saw the poor fugitive, took her toe hardened hand and read in her face deep suffering and an ardent longing for freedom, I could not help bid her be of good cheer. I told her that 1,000 hearts were aching for her, and they were glad that one child of hers was safe with the angels. Her only reply was a deep despair of anguish, such as no word can speak. And she also, but I thought that, and I bring Margaret Stone up because the fact that she's an abolitionist against slavery, and in particular women's rights. And so what she brings to the table in the courthouse is a gender perspective, a gender lens in terms of understanding the act of what Margaret Garner had done. And I think this is one of the significant pieces in this book in terms of painting a portrait, of getting us to understand how there's a need to re-articulate an understanding of Margaret Garner and her actions via one of the interviewers during that time frame.
Can you explain to me, like I said, I didn't read the book and I haven't was she pregnant when she?
I don't remember that. I don't remember
okay,
that.
so because I thought I'd read.
Well, mm-hmm.
I thought I'd read that she was pregnant, but then I didn't know when the child was born because I thought I remembered reading her trial only lasted 2 weeks. So.
Oh, you mean was she pregnant with the child that she killed?
No, I know there was the 2-year-old that she killed, and the infant, that what I read, the infant drowned when she and Robert were being transported further downriver. So I was just trying to figure out when the infant was born because I thought I had read that and there are 3 kids and she was pregnant at the time. So I just needed that clarified.
Oh, okay. I need to go back. It's been a while since I read it. It's been a few months ago, and I don't recall her being pregnant at the time when after the trial. But I know that one child did drown. in the water when they, after the trial, when they were being transported back to somewhere in slavery. But I don't recall her being pregnant.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to.
The escape was on January 27th, 1856. Sure. And just a few years of slavery.
Mhm.
At the time. But
Okay, because she only lived 2 years after that. She died in 1858. Is that?
yeah, I don't have, that's why I was saying I'm not as prepared as I'd like to be. I don't have the timeline outlined.
Yeah, my understanding is that there was communication.
Right, she didn't live much. Maybe it may have been 2 years, if that long. I thought it was really ironic that the trial focused more on human being,
Right.
or property, and so ultimately they did decide that she was property.
Who had destroyed property.
Her,
Right.
her and her family were returned to their various so-called masters, because the husband was affiliated with one slaveholder, and so they were returned to slavery, and then because there was so much speculation about whether or not Garner's slaveholder had raped her, and feared that his family would try to escape again, or give other folk the idea about trying to escape. He sold them to his brother, who I think was in New Orleans. And so on that trip, the boat trip down from Kentucky down to New Orleans, the infant, I think there was a boat accident.
Right.
Yes.
Something happened on the boat, and that's when the infant was killed. And so there was further gossip and speculation that Margaret had killed that baby. But then ultimately she ended up down in New Orleans, I believe, and maybe it was a couple of years later when she herself died of, I think, typhoid fever.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I would like to spend a little time unpacking what that means. That as they were trying to determine her personhood, whether she was property or a human being with a rights-bearing human being, and
rights and responsibilities, because as property, she actually was not for murder.
She was tried for destroying property. Property, destroying her master's property and giving back to him for him to decide what her punishment, destroying his property to her. Those were her children, and so that whole complicated thing of for me, I talked about the Virginia Statute of 1662 when white men were able to conflate pleasure and profit when the children of enslaved mothers, the statute that changed English common law to children following the status of their father to that of children following the status of their mother, so that any child born of an enslaved woman was enslaved. And so they could sell, destroy, whatever they wanted to do with those children because they were property and without
Right.
any regrets to a mother's, the maternal bonds or their feelings. And so this whole notion and what I had written, because yes, the 13th Amendment was passed 9 years after her heroic deed. However, us, the rape of Black women continued, and I use the story of Ruby McCullum uh, to show that, you know, even that women still didn't have the right of their own bodies even after slavery ended. They were no longer property, but they were still no longer, I mean, still not human.
Right.
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 So who is
And even the way we're gunned down in the streets today
right?
suggests our humanity is still not recognized.
Right.
Um,
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Ruby McCullum. Who could you share? Who was that?
Ruby McCullum was from my understanding, she was a wealthy African American wife and mother who was repeatedly raped by her. Well, they don't call it rape, but she definitely wasn't a consenting mistress of a doctor. And from what I read, the doctor, uh, just like in Gardner's case, where she had a husband, he went to the husband and told him that he loved all his babies, his white ones and his nigger babies. And he had children by Ruby McCullum. And um, something came up. They're alleging that it was a dispute over a doctor's bill. And I think they're saying more so from her perspective, it was about her continued sexual abuse by this man, that she confronted him and she killed him. And she was
What's this?
Ruby McCullum.
When was it?
I don't know. I could look it up real quick. The year I have it written down, but
I mean, it's in this time frame.
it was after you know, maybe the early 20th century, but
Okay.
brought to focus what they call paramour rights, rights that
Ah,
white men could take with Black women with
okay.
impunity. But she was the first woman Black woman, who brought a court case against a white man because you know that that had not been done. A Black person had no claims in court against a white person. So she was the first woman to take her rapist to court.
Okay.
oh, wow.
I'm
Mm-hmm.
looking it up right here. It was in mm,
Oh, okay. Okay. Very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it makes me think about Danielle McGuire's book, At the Dark End of the Street,
Right. 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 Mm-hmm.
which is focused on what, like the 1940s and 50s. Um, and when white men were just going into neighborhoods and snatching girls out of their homes. Whatever it is they wanted to do. So that's a very interesting book if you can stomach it.
and Shawnee, I forget her name, Shawnee Lee, I believe it was. She talked about that happening to Fannie Lou Hamer's grandmother, that she had. I want to say she said the grandmother had as many as 23 children, and only 3 of them were dark skinned, not
Wow.
children.
Mhm.
So and when I thought about her story, this history is family history, and if
Yeah.
you trace her family, you see that somebody endured this. And I remember stories of my great grandmother in a rural part of Texas as having several children. She had a mate, but my mother says that several of her children were mulattoes.
Mm.
So this is just something that this is in our recent past.
Right. Right.
Yes,
Right.
very, very
Definitely.
recent. And so that's why when we hear today this talk of taking our country back, for some people that may be you know, a, pleasant thing to imagine, but for others of us, it nearly sends us into dramatic shock. Back to where? Back to what? You know.
Right. Right. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Wow.
So,
So you have another question, Karen?
no, I was just flipping through the book to see. Did you had a question, right? You have a question. You had some questions.
Um, I'll read this one, which is number 4. A bloody mess, an injured child, traumatized children and adults, and still Margaret Garner and the 3 generations of family who escaped to freedom by her side were not free. Centered on whether this woman who took the life of one of her children was property, incapable of being tried for murder, or a human being with all the rights and responsibilities that title implies. It seems like an ironic twist. Ultimately, the family was returned to slavery. With near daily reports of Black children being gunned down by law enforcement, how much has changed, in your opinion? Will we ever be free?
Right.
But I think I read through that, and I got the analogy, but I wondered if a better analogy would be the state taking claim of the children through foster care, and the fight that women have to try to maintain their children from the state. So Garner trying to hold on to her children um, out of the grasp of the Gaines and the U.S. Marshal and the bounty hunters that came after her. And, that's akin to me, to Child Protective Services showing up at women's doors to take their children for the slightest provocation. I've been looking at some of the issues of Black children in foster care and the disproportionality of African American children in those situations. And I think somebody said something about the fact that Black mothers or Garner was perceived as unfit, and this whole notion of unfitness and how that's propagated through the popular imagination, through the media, and just everything that we know that Black motherhood, just because it is not white motherhood, connotation of being deviant and deficient. And
Right.
so
Right.
Dorothy Roberts writes a lot about in Shattered Bonds, the color of child welfare. She talks about this whole notion. And so I think of, Eliza in 12 Years a Slave, and the woman that Harriet Jacobs talked about when they came and took her children away, the trauma, understanding how women across, I mean, the trauma that enacted on communities, generational trauma that produced. So I understand that, you know, the kids being shot down, and again, going back to the whole thing of reproductive freedom for Black women has never been about our kids or having abortion or having birth control, but to having to hold our children and to be able to maintain their lives. So I just think of a tighter analogy would be to that foster care. And I think we miss the exact numbers of children that are in foster care. I was just living in Illinois, and there are a couple of other states that have the highest rates of Black children being taken into foster care, and only 20 women whose children are taken are ever reunited with their children.
Wow.
The state finds some way to deem them unfit. They set high bars. They have to have a full-time job that enables them to maintain themselves and their children. A book that I read called Bad Mothers suggests that Black women are called bad mothers just because we maintain those kinship networks that we had out of Africa, where we had extended family members, intergenerational families. The child was actually a part of this connected family. But for patriarchal state family, the heteropatriarchal family is the one that's privileged. And because Black women are not seen as being able to maintain that, get married, and have that stability, that they created this madness for us.
Right.
Children are still, we still lose our children to the state because of those things. So I just think I link that to Garner's story.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I like that kind of link that you made, when we see this ongoing forms of oppression just repackaged and in another kind of way to oppress us, you know. And so until we can begin to tear down the walls of white supremacy and patriarchy, etc., then we can live other kind of lives that speaks to our own beliefs and spiritual beliefs and cultural practices. And so the foster care, I also see juvenile detention centers as a way of incarcerating our own children. I think about Khalif Browder's case and other Black youth who are incarcerated. So this is a system indeed that is working to destroy our people, working to destroy Black families, Black childhood, Black motherhood, etc. So we just see this ongoing continuation of that, just repackaged in a different kind of way.
And an increasing number of Black women are being imprisoned as well.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
And the whole issue of sterilizing incarcerated women, sterilizing.
Right.
Sterilizing. I mean, now we got this whole phenomenon of opioid abuse among white families, and you know, I'm just waiting to hear are sterilizing them. I mean, what is this? It's called Project Prevention now. We call it crack, where they were paying drug addicts to be sterilized. And
really? I didn't hear about that.
Exists now. It's called Project Prevention. It was started by a white woman who, in California, she and her Black husband became foster parents of a woman's 8 children. The last 4 had been born addicted to crack. And, you know, this was still when the whole idea of the crack baby flooding the schools with these problems existed, before this new research said it's more poverty than crack cocaine that creates the dysfunction with children who've been exposed. And so this woman started, it was called Children Requiring a Caring Community spelled with K. It's called CRACK. but they've since changed the name to Project Prevention, and they've expanded it to other countries now, so that they pay addicts upwards of $500 for either long-term or permanent sterilization. So,
Wow.
so
Wow.
that's going on. And then again, the incarceration, they found a lot of women in California prisons had been sterilized there. So, for me, Margaret Garner is an analytic to talk about reproductive justice or injustice.
Okay. Right. Right.
And how, to me, she claimed reproductive freedom
Right.
in her act. I mean, it was based on the limited choices that were available to her.
Mm-hmm.
But at moment, it was either physical death or social death.
Okay.
And she made a choice. So where we are supposed to have that whole notion of freedom is about choice. We still have limited choices.
Right. 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 That's
And for me, Amira, Margaret Garner is a lens to look at oppression more generally and how people respond to it. How people move toward freedom. And
right.
so Margaret, it's I think it's absolutely wonderful that Nikki Taylor has centered and Margaret Garner has inspired operas and plays and other books. There's a new film coming out soon about her. She is the central character of this story, this true story. But I'm also fascinated by this family of hers, who be fairly unusual. I mean, I think there were a lot more attempts at escape.
Right.
About in our common knowledge. But that there was this whole family with 3 generations of people in it.
Right.
Who made this move. And it was admirable, and I understand why they did it. But I think that if we only think about Margaret Garner, then we might think about what everyday people need to be pushed toward action. And they were there. They were there. They weren't murderous, but they were there. And so I think there's something.
Yeah.
You said her family was there and they weren't murderers. You're saying that they were present when
they had the courage to, under very treacherous, trying conditions, they put the plan together. They were on 2 different farms, 2 different plantations, miles apart. The husband on a small farm where apparently a part of the way that they earned money was by hiring him out to to do other work. So he kind of got to move around a little bit more and got to see the lay of the land. With a cousin in Cincinnati. You know, Ohio, Cincinnati, Ohio is right across the river from Lexington, Kentucky. And so he got to go to Cincinnati, but Cincinnati had the law that if a slave had traveled into Ohio, they were free. So he had gone to church service. He had kind of been around the city, made some connections. He's the one that put together the plan to bring all these people together on 2 different farms to do this escape. And then when they made it through this, as Africa was talking about, they had to cross this frozen Ohio River, led to, I think they had to travel like 16 miles in the middle of the night, cold winter night, to get to the river. Then they get across the river and they make it to his cousin's house. And his cousin has failed on making the arrangement with the abolitionists that would have quickly got the family out there. And that's how they got caught. Ended up getting caught. And so, you know, what is it? What do we need to learn about reliability, about character, about what?
Interesting.
I think
It
there's
seems like
a lot here in the whole family that's very fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Well, to me, it's interesting that there are several stories out there. You know, I think I went to Black Past Remembered and some other sites, and I would imagine Nikki Taylor's book is the definitive answer. But you know, so many of the things that I've read said that it was Margaret's relative who they had gone to her house. And so I think that
that's right. I think that's right. Yeah.
And he had left the house to go to make some plans or to connect with the person when the sheriffs arrived, because they else. And so if we think about the communication system back then. So, you know, they couldn't call ahead and say, you know, we're coming tonight. So, you know, just to make those plans. But what Harriet Tubman did again and again,
Mm-hmm.
and the bravery of those people who left and, you know, were able to make their way. So I don't think that's not the extraordinary part of the story. The fact that they did link up. And I guess my question would be how they knew that the river, other than the news reports, that the river had frozen over, because that was a rare occurrence. And I think that to create the conditions for this to happen, for this to become an issue that tested slave law, and for her to become this historical figure. But
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's so much that they did it, just the fact of everything else that surrounded Margaret Garner.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a fascinating story, particularly crossing that frozen river with all those kids. That is fascinating. But one of the things when you read the historiography about slavery, what you find is that they were consistent, all forms of resistance to it. And there was people were escaping from it. Even if they were escaping and brought back, etc., they were escaping from it. An enslaver might go to sleep one night and wake up the next morning, and all his enslaved people have escaped So there's this history of enslaved people resisting and all by various forces means, as well as escaping, and especially those who lived close to border states that were engaged in abolitionist work, particularly Ohio. So there was much more levels of communications between people who lived on the border of Ohio and engaging in abolitionist work, anti-slavery work, with those who were on the borders of slave states like Kentucky. So I think those kind of stories need to come more to light to help us understand this whole history of slavery, and not, too often there's too many myths that are told or not enough stories that are told. But we do need to understand that this was ongoing forms of resistance, or ongoing forms of escaping from it. I really love that TV show, The Underground, because it really speaks to agency, and people engaging in their own agency of liberating themselves and going back, like Harriet Tubman, and in that show Underground, of liberating their own people and others. Mm-hmm.
And even
Yeah.
like you said, sometimes they escaped and, just for a few days, absconding,
Right.
going off into the woods and, cooling off and then coming back, or, running off, getting caught and losing half a foot like Kunta Kinte. So that's the big thing to for people to know, that people just didn't acquiesce to their oppression. They didn't acquiesce
Right.
to the system
Right.
of slavery. They didn't just well, you got me, and sit around the slave cabin strumming banjos in the evening when the work was done. And I think that that's where historians, that's where community historians and educated scholars need to do the work of to children, telling these stories, because the story that they're getting in school is, just that this was
Right.
slavery. They hear about Harriet Tubman, and but like she was an anomaly,
Right.
and that there weren't constant ongoing resistance. They don't hear about maroon communities,
Right.
and um, that people actually did escape and establish communities. I and I was thinking about this when the sister was talking about the fact that Margaret's husband held on to her even though he knew that she had been raped. Daughters of the Dusk and Eli,
Oh, yeah.
tension was
Right.
whether or not he could deal with his wife, knowing that another man had wrote, however he put it, that another man had been riding his wife. And
Right.
so having to deal with that. And then they bring in the Nana Pazant ancestors, and just that whole spiritual thing. And I think that that has been our salvation, is that we
Right.
are spiritual people. And but I think how we interpret that, because again, I will go to heaven and it'll be better. What is it? Whoopi Goldberg in Color Purple. This life don't last forever, so like grin and bear it and get over it. But there were too many of us that use spirituality, ancestral traditions, for resistance. And I was pleased to see that there's going to be that conference where they talk about African traditional religion and spirituality as forms and modes of resistance.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, the other book group that I do is called the Global Black Feminist Reading Circle.
Uh-huh.
And I started to use that banner for today's event, since Nikki Taylor does Garner's life and experience through a feminist lens. But I wanted to do it as the Revolutionary Love Leadership series because there are aspects of this that I see as love. So I want to pose the question to you. In the reading that speaks to you or strikes you as an example of revolutionary love, and what was it?
So how are you defining revolutionary love?
However you want to.
Huh?
However you want to.
Oh, okay. Well, I see this doggone determination to be free and liberated, and to have a level of agency and determine. This is what I see at Margaret Garner.
Mhm.
Her strong determination to take control of her own life and decide whether or not she's going to be enslaved or her children are going to be enslaved and not be the property of Archibald Gaines, her enslaver. And so to me, that's a form of revolutionary love, or even when, so that's a form of revolutionary love, even if it means killing my own children. I'm going to determine, the outcome of this. And that's how I see that. I'm going to determine the outcome of our life,
Mhm.
even if it means killing my own kids or killing myself. And so when I kind of think about that, I kind of think about Huey Newton and his, I think he had a book called Revolutionary Suicide. And I kind of see parallels to that, and it's a way of showing a level of agency and re-articulating how, an outcome is going to go down in an oppressive white supremacist society. And be it suicide, be it infanticide, or whatever, I'm seeing it kind of a parallel. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Amira?
I'm still thinking through. So.
Well, for me, it would just be the fact that, as you pointed out, her husband's um, uh, willingness to stay with his wife um, inside this type of violence that they lived under, and therefore those children that were not his, that because he had no way of knowing when she was pregnant whether those babies would be his or Gaines or whoever else might have had access to her. So his willingness to stay with her, her love for her children was revolutionary love. Um, uh, the commitment, as Africa said, that um, to claim agency for herself and for her children when law said that she had no claim over her own body, much less the bodies of her children, but and the children of their masters. And I thought I had remembered reading somewhere that in cases of infanticide, or maybe this was more of a romanticized novel, women who bore children of their masters or of rape that they just simply could not love, those were children more likely that women would kill. But this woman, children regardless of their paternity. So the whole family, uh, Robert and Margaret and their children, that's revolutionary love. That's what we lack today. Men don't want to get with a woman who has children. They could take care of a child that's not his. And I've been looking at, and don't judge me, paternity court, and see men say, well, if that baby's not mine, if the DNA test comes back and that baby's not mine, I'm out of here. Evidently, you didn't love her in the first place because your ego is that strong. But again, we are living in a culture that has this type of toxic masculinity. This
Right.
ego is the kind of thing that would not allow men to step up to the plate and take care of children who are not theirs. So anytime waking up every day and loving yourself, to me, that's revolutionary love.
Right.
To having to hold children in this environment of evolving slavery, because we have not gotten beyond where Margaret was in 18. She made her heroic act. We,
Right.
we think we have, but it's just an evolved system. So, children, loving a mate, having a family, all of that to me is revolutionary love.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And for me, revolutionary love is the kind of love that has the power to change the world. And so all of those acts of resistance that the two of you were talking about a few minutes ago, ultimately change the world of slavery. That so many generations have been trapped in. And so I think we're under a lot of pressure to not love,
Mm-hmm.
to not love ourselves, to not love each other. Because it just doesn't fit the capitalist past. So to make a choice to be loving, I believe in and of itself is a revolutionary act.
Mm-hmm.
And this family example of what that looks like.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right.
Africa, do you have the book with you?
Yes.
Yeah, you do. Each chapter starts off with a poem. Alternate reading a couple of those.
Okay.
There's one on page 7, for example.
7.
Yeah.
Okay. Then said the mournful mother, if Ohio cannot save, I will do a deed for freedom. Shalt find each child a grave. I will save my precious children from their darkly threatened doom. I will hew their path to freedom through the portals of the tomb. And that's by Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, 1857. Wow, that's powerful. That's powerful.
Read there's one on page 24.
Mm-hmm.
I have put forth the treasures of my soul. They lay like doves around my heart, lest some cruel hand should tear my household wreaths apart. Childish glance looks curious in my anxious eye. She little knows that for her sake, deep shadows round my spirit lie. Always could I forget, my home night seems a joyous spot, but with their sunshine mirth, I blend the darkness of their future lot.
Mm-hmm.
By Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, 1857.
Now, were these poems that were written specifically because of her case?
Most of them, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Africa, there's another one at 59.
59, okay. Thus did a Roman father slay. oh yeah, father slave, the idol of his soul, to screen her from a tyrant's lust, a tyrant's foul control. Though this was done in days of yore, the act was truly brave. What value, pray, is life to man, if that man be a slave? Go and ask Margaret Garner, who's now in prison bound. No braver women's ever have rod Columbia's slave cursed round. Why did she, with a mother's hand, deprive her child of breath? She'll tell you with a Roman smile that slavery's worse than death. And that's by James M. Bell, 1856. So I think I really like how she used these poems in the beginning of each chapter, because it really draws you into the chapter and it speaks to the horrific conditions and the experience that she encountered. I think it's very powerful.
Mm-hmm. Why don't you do one more? There's one on page 92.
92. Okay. I am black, you see, and the babe who lay on my bosom so was far too white for me, as white as the ladies who scorn to pray beside me at church but yesterday, though my tears had washed a place for my meat. My own child, I could not bear to look in his face, it was so white. I covered him up with a kerchief dear. I covered his face in close and tight. And he moaned and struggled, as well might be, for the white child wanted his liberty. Ha ha, he wanted his master right. And that's by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, 1848. Mm-hmm.
That piece speaks to what I was saying about hearing these children. So if I heard you correctly, she was talking about
You froze a little
white.
bit. Amira, say that again, please. Yep. I think she's frozen.
Amira? Okay, it looks like she's froze up.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Well, we've done good to get through nearly 2 hours without a major technology issue.
Right? Yeah. Uh-huh.
I am quite
Hear me?
we hear you now.
Okay. All right. So did you hear any parts of what I said?
No, not really.
It sounded like that poem, if I heard it correctly, was alluding to the fact that enslaved women could not bear to raise the children of their rapists. And what I was saying about infanticide being kind of particular to that, particular to women who had their rapist children. Not, I mean, the breeding was prolific, where there was women were being studied by black men. And one of the things that I found really interesting about the whole thing. Froze again.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I heard interesting about the whole thing.
So it's that how the enslaved population increased between 1808, when the end of the slave trade, Atlantic slave trade, and 1865, it increased by 3 million people. When in 1619, then the first 21 were bought over. By 1808, there were only 1 million here. So, of slave breeding was prolific in those 50 years, and that and it wasn't just women having children by white men. Black men were used to stud these women, creating these single family, these single mother households. But imagine instances of infanticide likely what that poem just described. A Black mother having to look into the face of these white children they were forced.
Okay, right. It indeed does speak to that. Yes, yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, Amira, thank you so much for joining us. You have brought so much good information and wonderful reflections. And but I still want you to read the book. And tell us again about the book you're writing.
I'm writing a book on Africana mothering, and haven't come up with the exact title yet, but the running title is Jolly Musa. Jolly Musa is a storyteller in Mande. And so I'm telling the story about different aspects of motherhood. And I try to start each chapter with the story of a mother. Like one of my sheroes is Anna Julia Cooper. She was a prolific scholar and mother. And, I talk about the last chapter is how I got over. And I talk about Clara Ward and that song and what her mother did that inspired that song. So I'm trying to pull it all together. I have a week, the revisions done. And that's the reason why I hadn't read the book, because when Africa told me about it, I went online. I don't have a Kindle. I use my grandchildren's Kindle just to download it to read it real quick, because I did want to get facts, because like I said, I think there's a lot of different stories out there about Garner, and I just really want to get clarity on several things. And I appreciate this conversation this evening for bringing me that. So thank you for inviting me out.
Right. Thank you for your contribution. I learned a lot from you. Thank you. Oh, and I did work on Anna Julia Cooper. Some research on her for her educational philosophy, and met her family members, her descendants. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah, did archival research. See.
You said, what about her family members?
Oh, for my research that I had done on Anna Julia Cooper for my dissertation, I met her. I've been in the archives in DC, met her descendants, and so we could talk.
Yeah.
Need information on Cooper.
Yeah.
And do you have any books out there for us to know about, Karen? Africa.
Yeah, so I in 2014, my area of research is African American women educators, late 19th, early 20th century. Anna Julia Cooper was one of the women I had done analysis of her own educational thinking and perspectives. But in 2014, I wrote a book on African American women educators that looked at their teaching practices and their perspectives from the 1800s up into 1960. Is an edited book. So published by Roman and Littlefield, which came out in 2014.
Oh, very interesting.
Yeah.
All right, well, anytime you all want to talk about your books, your works, I am willing to host the space. And Amira, look me up. I hope you look me up and friend me on Facebook. My first name is Loga, Loga. There are not a lot of us out there, but there's some. So I'm Loga Michelle Odom. And
I will.
Yeah, definitely.
Are you in Africa Sankofa friends?
We are.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, I'll find you through her. I'll connect that way.
Okay. All right.
Thank you for this. I enjoyed it.
All right. I really did too, even though I stole these 2 hours away from my grandchildren who are right on the other side of my door, probably tearing up the house now. So much for this respite, and I look forward to the next time.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Peace.